The air in the courtroom was so still that you could hear the faint hum of the lights above. Every conversation had stopped. Every movement had frozen. All eyes were locked on the two women standing just feet apart, one, a living legend of the federal bench. The other, a rising star in American politics who had just challenged the very institution the judge represented. Judge Edith H. Jones had presided over thousands of cases across nearly 4 decades, but this wasn't one of them. There was no jury, no defendant, no legal motion to decide, only a clash of principles, of ideals, and of generations. Across from her stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, a first-term lawmaker whose fiery passion for reform had made her one of the most talked-about new voices in Washington. What began as a routine judicial conference had suddenly turned into something historic. It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't planned. But when Crockett's bold remarks about outdated judicial thinking echoed through the room, the silence that followed said everything. You could feel the tension, the quiet realization that a line had just been crossed. Yet no one could look away. It was the kind of silence that only happens when people know they're witnessing a moment that will be talked about for years. And then, with the authority of a lifetime on the bench, Judge Jones rose from her seat. Her voice, calm but unmistakably firm, cut through the stillness. What followed would not only test the boundaries of power between Congress and the courts, but also redefine what humility, respect, and leadership really mean in American public life. Long before that tense courtroom moment, Edith Holland Jones had already carved her name into the history of American law. To those who follow the judiciary, her reputation was more than just impressive, it was legendary. Born in Philadelphia and raised with the kind of discipline that demands excellence, Jones grew up believing that hard work and principle mattered more than popularity. She was one of the few women in her class at the University of Texas School of Law, a sharp, unflinching presence who never once asked for shortcuts or sympathy. From the moment she graduated, people noticed something different about her. She didn't just want to practice law, she wanted to protect the Constitution itself. When President Ronald Reagan appointed her to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit in 1985, it was a defining moment. At just 36 years old, she became one of the youngest judges ever to sit on that bench. Colleagues described her as fearless, meticulous, and relentless in her pursuit of fairness. She read everything, questioned everything, and wrote with the kind of precision that made her rulings required reading in law schools across the country. Over nearly 40 years, Judge Jones presided over more than 3,000 cases, each one reinforcing her belief that the judiciary must remain independent, immune from the shifting winds of politics. To her, the Constitution wasn't just a document, it was a promise. A safeguard that only works when judges interpret it with restraint, not emotion. Yet for all her accolades and respect, Jones had grown increasingly uneasy in recent years. She watched as the national conversation around justice grew louder, angrier, and more divided. Politicians from both sides began attacking court decisions whenever they didn't like the outcomes. Talk shows mocked judges. Social media commentators questioned their legitimacy. To Jones, that wasn't just noise, it was a threat. She once told a group of law students, "If judges start ruling to please the crowd instead of upholding the law, we lose everything that keeps our democracy stable." Those words would soon take on new meaning, because sitting across from her that morning at the Federal Judicial Conference was someone who represented that very growing tension, a Congresswoman whose passion for reform was as fierce as her belief that the system needed to change. And the moment their worlds collided, decades of quiet concern inside Judge Jones finally met its test. Before her name echoed through the halls of Congress, Jasmine Crockett was known for something far less glamorous, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Long before television cameras or political spotlights, her days were spent in cramped offices, stacks of case files piled to the ceiling, representing clients the system often forgot. Born and raised in St. Louis, Missouri, Crockett's journey wasn't one of privilege or easy victories. She worked her way through law school driven by a single conviction: that justice shouldn't depend on the size of your bank account or the color of your skin. As a public defender and later a civil rights attorney, she became a voice for the unheard, the wrongfully accused, the oversentenced, the overlooked. Colleagues described her courtroom presence as electric, passionate, sharp, unafraid to challenge authority. And it was that energy, that refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice, that carried her from the courtroom to the Capitol. When she ran for Congress, her campaign wasn't built on polished talking points. It was built on stories, real people, real pain, and a promise to shake up a system she believed was stuck in the past. When she arrived in Washington, she didn't waste time making noise. Within her first year, Crockett had already made headlines for her unapologetic stance on justice reform. She spoke bluntly about sentencing disparities, prison overcrowding, and laws she believed had failed the people they were meant to protect. Supporters loved her for it finally, someone who spoke without fear. But in the marble corridors of the legal establishment, her words struck a different chord. To some judges and legal scholars, her comments about outdated judicial thinking sounded like an attack on the very independence that keeps the courts above politics. To others, she was simply telling the truth, voicing frustrations that many had whispered about for years. Either way, it was clear, Jasmine Crockett was not a politician who played it safe. And that fearless attitude would soon place her in a setting where boldness carried real consequences. When the invitation arrived for her to speak at the annual Federal Judicial Conference, a gathering usually reserved for quiet discussions on sentencing guidelines and constitutional trends, Crockett accepted immediately. For her, it was an opportunity to bring her reform message directly to the people who had the power to change the system from within. What she didn't know was that among those in attendance sat a woman who had spent decades defending that system, Judge Edith H. Jones. One believed reform demanded pressure. The other believed progress required restraint. Their paths were about to meet in a way neither could have predicted. The conference hall was supposed to be calm, a quiet exchange of ideas between judges, lawyers, and lawmakers. But the moment Jasmine Crockett stepped up to the podium, the tone shifted. She didn't read from a script. She didn't tiptoe around delicate topics. Instead, she spoke like someone who'd been holding her words in for far too long. Her voice was clear, measured, but pulsing with conviction. "We talk about justice as if it's timeless," she said, scanning the room. "But how can it be timeless when so many of our rulings are frozen in a time that no longer exists?" A murmur rippled through the audience. The line wasn't in the official program, and it wasn't the kind of thing judges expected to hear at a judicial conference. But Crockett didn't stop there. She pressed harder. She spoke about sentencing disparities, about communities left behind, about legal precedents that, in her words, still carry the fingerprints of a different America. To many listening, it was a powerful, much-needed wake-up call. But to others, especially the judges who had dedicated their lives to upholding the letter of the law, it sounded dangerously close to questioning the very foundation of judicial impartiality. And sitting near the front row, Judge Edith Jones didn't flinch, but she didn't look away either. She watched Crockett intently, her face unreadable. For years, Jones had warned that modern politics was creeping too close to the courts. Now that warning was standing at the podium, holding a microphone. Crockett's next words made the air in the room tighten even more. "Respect for the law isn't the same as worshiping tradition," she said. "If the law stops evolving, then justice stops breathing." It was a bold statement, one that hung in the air like static. For a split second, no one moved. Then slowly, heads began to turn toward Judge Jones. Everyone knew she wouldn't let that go unanswered. Not here, not in her house. And sure enough, when the applause faded and the moderator opened the floor for responses, the silence that followed was thick enough to cut through. Judge Jones adjusted her glasses, leaned toward the microphone, and cleared her throat. What she said next would turn a simple policy discussion into one of the most talked about confrontations in the modern history of American law. When Judge Edith Jones finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The room quieted instantly, not out of fear, but out of sheer presence. There are moments when authority doesn't come from volume, but from the weight of years of experience, of a lifetime spent holding the line. This was one of those moments. "Congresswoman," Jones began, her tone calm but edged with steel. "The law does evolve, but it must never bend to the whims of the moment." She paused, letting the words breathe. "We don't serve public opinion. We serve the Constitution." The hall was silent again. No one shifted in their seat. Even the air seemed heavier. Crockett met her gaze, unwavering but respectful. Jones continued, her words precise and deliberate, like a surgeon making clean incisions. "You speak of justice as something emotional, something alive," she said, "but justice cannot feel. It must stand. If judges begin to chase what's popular instead of what's right, we stop being guardians of the law and start becoming politicians in robes." A few quiet nods rippled through the front rows: senior judges, law clerks, legal scholars who'd built careers on that very principle. But behind them, younger attendees shifted uncomfortably. They understood where Jones was coming from, but they also felt the sting of her words. Crockett had challenged the system. Jones had defended it. And in that exchange, a deeper tension emerged, one that ran far beyond the room itself. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was the collision of two eras. For Jones, the courts had always been sacred ground, a place where emotion had to yield to order. But for Crockett, that same detachment was part of the problem. She saw too many people crushed by rules written in ink that refused to change. As Jones finished, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "The moment we decide that empathy is a substitute for law," she said quietly, "we've already lost the very thing you claim to fight for." The words landed like a verdict. Not shouted, not dramatic, just final. You could feel the weight of them sinking in a lifetime of belief, condensed into one measured statement. But what came next wasn't scripted. Crockett wasn't the type to stay silent, and the crowd wasn't ready for what she was about to say next. For a few tense seconds after Judge Jones finished speaking, no one dared to move. It felt like the air itself had stopped circulating. Every person in that room, from the newest clerk to the most seasoned justice, waited to see how Jasmine Crockett would respond. Then, instead of the fiery comeback many expected, Crockett did something that caught everyone off guard. She smiled. A small, almost imperceptible smile, not of defiance, but of respect. She leaned toward her microphone, and when she spoke, her tone was calm, almost gentle. "Judge Jones," she began, "I hear you. And maybe that's exactly what's been missing: more listening between the people who interpret the law and the people who live under it." It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a bridge. A rare moment when passion met humility and tension began to turn into conversation. The crowd eased, shoulders dropped, heads tilted forward. Everyone wanted to know where this was going. Crockett continued, her words careful but full of meaning. "I don't believe empathy replaces the law," she said. "I believe it helps us see the law clearly enough to know when it's leaving people behind." That line changed everything. It didn't erase the divide, but it shifted the energy. For the first time, Judge Jones's expression softened ever so slightly. The two women, symbols of two generations, two approaches to justice, found common ground in a simple truth. Both wanted the system to endure, just in different ways. After the session, witnesses recalled something remarkable. The judge approached the Congresswoman quietly, away from cameras and applause. They spoke for several minutes, not as rivals, but as professionals who realized they were fighting for the same outcome: fairness from opposite sides of the same wall. No one knows exactly what was said in that private exchange, but word spread quickly. The two had agreed to continue the discussion, perhaps even to collaborate on reforms that protected judicial integrity and addressed public trust. That day there were no victors, only voices that finally met in the middle. In a world obsessed with winning arguments, this moment was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it mattered, because sometimes progress doesn't come from shouting the loudest, it comes from realizing that silence can mean listening too. What happened in that courtroom didn't stay there for long. Within hours, clips of the exchange began circulating online, short, out-of-context fragments that spread like wildfire. Headlines called it a showdown, a clash, a generational face-off. But those who were actually in the room knew it wasn't about conflict, it was about correction. For Judge Edith Jones, the moment became a quiet reaffirmation of everything she'd stood for. That the law's strength comes from patience, not popularity. In the weeks that followed, she released no public statements, gave no interviews, and offered no clarifications. She didn't need to. Her words had already done the talking. But behind the scenes, she began encouraging young clerks to attend more community-based legal programs, small steps that, for her, symbolized listening without surrender. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was equally revealing. Her office was flooded with messages, some praising her courage, others questioning her restraint. But she didn't retreat into political talking points. Instead, She used the moment to launch a new initiative focused on rebuilding trust between lawmakers and the judiciary, emphasizing that respect and reform can coexist. The clip continued to circulate, but something interesting happened over time. Instead of fueling division, it started inspiring dialogue. Law students debated judicial independence with newfound respect. Political commentators for once focused on civility. Even long-retired judges praised both women for modeling what true leadership looks like under pressure. In an era where outrage travels faster than truth, this moment became an exception, proof that two people with completely different worldviews could confront each other, disagree deeply, and still walk away with dignity intact. It wasn't just a viral exchange. It was a rare reminder that strength doesn't always come from dominance. Sometimes it comes from listening when it would be easier to fight. And long after the headlines faded, the story of Judge Jones and Representative Crockett continued to echo, not because of what was said, but because of what it represented. That even in a divided nation, progress doesn't begin with agreement. It begins with the courage to stand firm and the humility to hear the other side. In a time when shouting often replaces listening and pride overshadows principle, that quiet moment in a federal courtroom offered something our democracy has been starving for: mutual respect in action. What began as a confrontation between two powerful women, a seasoned judge and a passionate lawmaker, ended as a living lesson in how democracy actually survives. It wasn't the kind of moment that fits neatly into a headline or a viral clip. It was deeper than that. It showed that the American experiment doesn't depend on everyone agreeing. It depends on everyone respecting the rules that let us disagree without destroying each other. Judge Edith Jones didn't compromise her principles. She stood her ground, calmly defending the sacred independence of the judiciary, a branch meant to interpret, not to please. And Representative Jasmine Crockett didn't lose her conviction. She simply found the courage to evolve, to learn, to let humility guide her without dimming her passion for justice. That balanced conviction without arrogance, respect without surrender, is the foundation of every healthy democracy. Because when our leaders can admit mistakes, when institutions can speak to one another instead of over each other, when wisdom and humility share the same stage, the system works as it was meant to. In that courtroom, we witnessed something rare. Two public servants reminding the nation that character, not clout, defines leadership. It wasn't about who won the exchange. It was about what won: the Constitution, the idea that power only works when it's bounded by respect. So if you're watching this and wondering whether moments like this still happen in America, the answer is yes. They just don't make as much noise as outrage does. But they matter more, because they remind us what democracy looks like when it's at its best: principled, humble, and unafraid to learn. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of strength our country needs most right now.